The sky above the outer rim convoy split open like torn metal, not with fire or lightning, but with silence. An Imperial Star Destroyer task force, translating from hyperspace, should have emerged in ordered formation over empty vacuum, engines flaring, sensor grid sweeping. Instead, space itself rippled into a circular wound of blinding white geometry. Navigation alarms screamed across every bridge station. Stars warped into spirals. Then gravity vanished. The lead destroyer plunged forward through a tunnel of impossible color, followed by two escort cruisers and a screen of TIE fighters dragged helplessly in their wake. Crews felt their bodies lift against restraints, as if reality had briefly forgotten its own rules. When normality returned, it did so violently. Hulls groaned. Consoles spat sparks. And outside the viewport was not space at all, but sky, blue, cloud-streaked, and impossibly close. The destroyer hung above a world of green continents and silver oceans, its shadow stretching across mountain ranges and patchwork farmland. No orbital lanes. No satellites. No traffic. Just atmosphere and wind shear screaming across shields. Emergency stabilization thrusters fired in rolling bursts, holding the kilometer-long warship in the upper stratosphere. Bridge officers stared at their scopes in disbelief. Sensor returns showed combustion-based settlements, animal populations, steel fortifications, and energy readings that did not match any known reactor signature. Some readings behaved like radiation but pulsed in rhythmic waves, almost biological. The fleet commander did not raise his voice. He simply ordered a full-spectrum scan and quarantine protocol. Unknown regions were not unusual to the Empire. Unknown physics was. Below, on a high plateau ringed with stone watchtowers, soldiers in polished plate armor watched a new star appear in daylight. It grew from a pinprick into a floating dagger of gray metal that blotted out the sun. Horses panicked. Banner lines snapped in the wind. Mage priests began shouting detection rites, their staffs glowing as they sensed a pressure in the air like a storm that had not yet broken. The object did not resemble any dragon, fortress, or skyship of their chronicles. It did not fly, it dominated. Then smaller black shapes screamed downward from its belly, shrieking like metal falcons. TIE fighters cut through clouds and made their first pass over a medieval army formation assembling on the plateau road. Their engines howled with a sound like tearing steel. The shockwave alone scattered infantry ranks. The second pass was lower. Targeting computers flagged siege engines as artillery analogs. Green laser fire reduced catapults to exploding splinters. War wagons ignited. Soldiers dug behind rock outcrops as lines of incandescent bolts stitched the ground in straight, merciless rows. No warning shots. No diplomacy. The Empire had arrived in a new theater and responded exactly as doctrine demanded. Immediate air superiority. Rapid intimidation. Zero hesitation. On the destroyer's bridge, officers confirmed breathable atmosphere, manageable gravity, and no recognizable orbital infrastructure. That triggered automatic classification, pre-hyperdrive civilization. Standard protocol recommended covert observation before contact. The Admiral overrode it. The dimensional rupture, now visible behind them as a rotating circular aperture suspended in high orbit, was shrinking by fractional degrees per minute. Whatever had pulled them here would not hold forever. This was no time for anthropological patience. A forward operating zone had to be established before the passage collapsed. He ordered walkers prepped, landing barges loaded, and stormtrooper legions deployed to secure the anomaly site on the surface directly beneath the aperture. The first landing craft descended like armored meteors, repulsors flattening forests in concentric circles. Trees snapped. Soil blasted outward. Creatures fled in every direction. The ramps dropped and white-armored troops advanced into a world that smelled of pine resin, wet earth, and wood smoke. Their helmet filters tagged pollen, fungal spores, and airborne compounds unfamiliar but non-lethal. Motion scanners lit with biological signatures, dozens, then hundreds, approaching fast from multiple vectors. Not vehicles. Not droids. Cavalry. They came over the ridge in thunder, riders with lances, shields painted in heraldic colors, cloaks snapping behind them. At their center rode figures in deep blue robes, whose hands glowed with contained light. The stormtrooper commander did not interpret symbolism. He interpreted velocity and weapons posture. He ordered a firing line. Blaster rifles rose in perfect synchronization. The first volley carved luminous lines through the charge. Shields vaporized. Armor slagged. Horses fell mid-stride. Yet the formation did not break. The robed figures thrust their staffs forward, and the air itself thickened. A distortion field shimmered like heat haze, and the next volley bent, refracted, and scattered. Not fully stopped, but altered. Impacts struck wide. The troopers adjusted instantly, switching to explosive rounds. The second volley detonated inside the distortion veil. The shockwave tore it apart. When the smoke cleared, the surviving riders retreated in chaos, except for one of the robed figures, who stood alone, staff planted, eyes burning with reflected red blaster light. He spoke words no translator could parse. Lightning, not technological, not force-shaped, but raw, struck the lead walker descending behind the trooper line. The machine staggered as power relays overloaded. For the first time since arrival, an Imperial vehicle took visible damage from a primitive defender. High above, science officers marked the energy signature and flagged it Priority Alpha. This is where the galaxy changes, when two incompatible systems of power collide, and both realize the other is real. If you want to see more characters and empires collide with unfamiliar worlds, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character or faction you want to see enter the galaxy next. Within the hour, a perimeter base rose from prefabricated segments around the surface anchor point beneath the shrinking aperture. Sensor towers stabbed upward. Shield generators hummed to life. Probe droids deployed in expanding spirals. Intercepts of local signal methods, fire beacons, runner-outs, crystal-based communication relays were logged and decoded. The Empire did not see a fantasy realm. It saw an unsecured resource zone with unusual energy phenomena and no orbital defense grid. Classification updated. Compliant after demonstration of force. But the demonstration had already changed tone. Recon squads reported creatures airborne without engines. Heat signatures matched biological organisms the size of freighters. One passed through cloud cover, scaled, winged, breathing a cone of fire that splashed harmlessly across shield domes but triggered every alarm on the board. Walkers tracked it. Target locks failed intermittently when it passed through pockets of the same distortion energy used by the rogue defender. Technology could kill it, but not predict it cleanly. That uncertainty moved the situation from routine occupation to active study target. The Admiral authorized Phase 2 doctrine. Establish dominance, capture specimens, secure native leadership nodes, and identify exploitable power structures. Dropships launched again, this time not toward armies, but toward cities. Stone-walled capitals, tower complexes glowing. Academies perched on cliffs. The Empire would not negotiate with mystery. It would dissect it. And across the continent, bells began to ring, not in celebration, but in warning. A gate had opened in the sky, and through it marched an order that did not believe in prophecy, balance, or fate. Only control. The first confirmed contact did not happen on a battlefield, but in the sky above a kingdom that had never imagined war could fall from orbit. The gate stood open like a wound between realities, its edges rippling with unstable light, and through it marched armored legions, expecting swords, beasts, and scattered resistance. What they encountered instead was a world organized by magic, prophecy, and ancient rivalries, a world that looked primitive on sensors, but burned with energies their instruments could not classify. The Empire's forward fleet held position above the gate aperture on the fantasy world side, star destroyers casting continent-sized shadows over farmland and castle states, and the psychological impact alone shattered the balance of power among local rulers within hours. Messengers rode day and night. Temples declared omens fulfilled. Sorcerers reported that the sky itself had been replaced by metal mountains that radiated cold suns. Imperial doctrine demanded rapid dominance, but doctrine assumed technological asymmetry, not metaphysical variables. Probe droids descended first and failed in unexpected ways. Some vanished from telemetry in regions saturated with magical fields. Others returned corrupted data streams filled with impossible geometry and biological readings that matched no known taxonomy. One transmission recorded a dragon circling a probe in apparent curiosity before destroying it with a beam of heat that overloaded every thermal scale in the sensor package. The loss was written off as exotic plasma discharge, but the uncertainty forced command to slow the standard pacification timeline. Instead of immediate planetary shield suppression and coordinated terror strikes, the Empire initiated layered reconnaissance, and that hesitation gave the fantasy world time to react. The first ground engagement occurred when an Imperial landing regiment secured a plateau near the gate to establish a permanent fortress hub. Walkers deployed. Sensor towers rose. TIE patrols screamed overhead. Within hours, local forces assembled below the ridge line, not as a unified army, but as converging hosts, armored knights under feudal banners, robed mage circles, beast-mounted skirmishers, and entities that did not fit any military category at all. Imperial officers expected a rout. Instead, the opening exchange rewrote their threat assessment. Ballista bolts, guided by spellcraft, arced with impossible corrections and struck low-flying aircraft. Lightning called from clear skies chained across walker armor joints. Illusion fields masked entire troop movements until they were within striking range. The Empire still held the advantage in firepower, but it was no longer a simple equation of blasters versus steel. What shocked Imperial tacticians most was not the raw power of magic, but its adaptability. When blaster fire proved devastating, defensive enchantments shifted to refractive barriers. When walkers used thermal imaging to see through concealment, druids altered the temperature of entire forest zones, turning scanners blind. The battlefield became a negotiation between physics and will. In response, the Empire escalated in the way it always did. Heavier weapons, broader suppression, less restraint. The plateau was ringed with artillery. Air support intensified. Entire woodlands were burned away to remove magical cover. Victory came, but it was costly and slow, and slowness was something Imperial command culture did not tolerate comfortably. Meanwhile, political shockwaves tore through the native civilizations. Some rulers sought immediate surrender, believing the newcomers to be gods of iron. Others called for holy war. A third faction saw opportunity and offered alliance, tribute, and intelligence in exchange for protection against their rivals. Imperial envoys exploited these divisions with clinical efficiency. Demonstration strikes were performed against uninhabited mountains to display destructive capacity. Holographic projections showed fleets without number waiting beyond the sky. Collaboration estates were armed with surplus blasters and shield emitters, instantly shifting regional power balances and ensuring that resistance movements had enemies on both sides. The Empire did not need to conquer every kingdom directly if it could restructure the political map to fight itself on imperial terms. Yet the gate itself remained the strategic center of gravity. Its energy signature fluctuated with emotional and mystical surges from the fantasy side, something Imperial science teams could measure, but not fully explain. Attempts to stabilize and control the aperture using tractor field harmonics produced partial success, but magical interference caused periodic surges that disrupted the machinery. This created windows where unauthorized crossings occurred. Creatures slipped through into Imperial staging zones. Some were captured and studied. Others escaped into supply corridors and caused cascading security failures. Stormtroopers trained for insurgents and droids found themselves hunting invisible predators and sentient swarms that ignored pain compliance protocols. Imperial research divisions began forced cooperation programs with captured mages and scholars. The goal was translation, not language, but law, the underlying rules that govern spellcraft. Early findings suggested that magic responded to intention patterns similar to neural command signals, meaning interface technology might eventually replicate it. That possibility ignited a classified initiative to weaponize hybrid systems. Focusing crystals paired with targeting computers, ritual circles etched with precision lasers, chant matrices converted into signal loops. Progress was uneven and often lethal to test subjects, but even partial success promised a breakthrough that could extend Imperial dominance beyond conventional reality. Resistance forces adapted as well. They learned that Imperial armor joints were vulnerable to transmutation spells, that comma rays could be cursed to broadcast false orders, that fear, something the Empire used as a weapon, could be reflected back through mass illusion. Entire phantom armies were conjured to draw fire and waste ammunition. Prophetic orders predicted strike patterns with unnerving accuracy, forcing commanders to randomize operations at the cost of efficiency. The war stopped being a simple invasion and became a contest of paradigms, each side trying to rewrite the other's assumptions faster than they could respond. Civilians across the fantasy world experienced the invasion not as a single event, but as a rolling catastrophe. Skies that once held storms and birds now held patrol craft and orbital silhouettes. Old gods were questioned. New cults formed around the Metal Empire from beyond the gate. Some worshipped it. Some cursed it. Some tried to summon powers even older and more dangerous in hopes of driving it away. Those deeper summonings began to register on Imperial deep sensors as anomalies below the crust, vast energy reservoirs stirring. Analysts warned that continued escalation might awaken forces neither side could control, but escalation was already built into the invasion model. By the end of the first campaign phase, the Empire controlled territory around the gate and several allied kingdoms, but the world was far from subdued. Supply lines were harassed by magical sabotage. Patrols disappeared in regions where reality behaved inconsistently. Reports accumulated of artifacts capable of disabling vehicles with a touch or rewriting memory after eye contact. The phrase theater contamination entered Imperial briefings, used to describe zones where standard causality could not be assumed. High Command faced a decision point. Treat the world as a prolonged experimental battlefield or commit overwhelming force to crush uncertainty under sheer destructive scale. The debate would define the next phase of the war, and whichever path they chose, the conflict had already become something far more dangerous than a routine cross-dimensional conquest. The Empire chose escalation, but not the blunt annihilation many regional governors first demanded. Instead, it deployed something more dangerous: systematic control layered with experimentation. The fantasy world was divided into operational grids, each assigned a command group tasked not only with conquest, but with classification. Every magical phenomenon, creature type, artifact class, and spell discipline was cataloged like a new branch of physics. Occupied cities were converted into research fortresses, where scholars worked under surveillance beside Imperial technologists. The invasion stopped looking like a war of expansion and started resembling a galaxy-scale laboratory. And that shift made the conflict more invasive than simple bombardment ever could. In the third campaign phase, Imperial strategy focused on severing mythic infrastructure. Rather than targeting armies first, strike teams hunted lane nexuses, ancient groves, dragon roosts, oracle towers, and relic vaults, the hidden pillars that enabled large-scale spellcraft. Analysts had concluded that magic here was not evenly distributed, but amplified through sacred geography and bloodline artifacts. Remove the amplifiers and resistance power would collapse into localized, manageable threats. Specialized assault units were formed with sensor-tuned armor and rotating shield frequencies designed to counter unknown energy spectra. They advanced with portable null field generators that disrupted spell formation within a limited radius. The generators were unstable and sometimes detonated, but where they functioned, magic faltered, and that changed the psychology of every battlefield encounter. The first null field victory produced overconfidence. An Imperial battalion neutralized a storm-calling citadel that had held off 3 mechanized pushes. With its rituals suppressed, the defenders fell quickly. Footage of spells failing midcast spread through the ranks and command briefings alike. It suggested that magic could be reduced to just another variable, and once reduced, dominated. But the reaction from the world itself was not passive. The spell traditions evolved in response. Casters shifted from structured incantations to instinctive casting. Wild magic zones increased. Instead of losing power, some regions became more chaotic and less predictable, producing effects beyond prior limits. Suppression did not end magic, it destabilized it, and instability favored no one. Local factions that had once fought each other began forming survival compacts. Old grudges were suspended under what became known as Skyfire truces. Knightly orders escorted mage caravans. Beast clans guarded human cities. Even rival priesthoods shared wards. The Empire's divide and rule model still worked in some territories, but where devastation was greatest, unity hardened. Resistance command structures became hybrid councils combining military, arcane, and prophetic leadership. Their operations improved rapidly. Ambushes were timed to solar storms that interfered with orbital scans. Enchanted fog banks rose exactly when dropships descended. Illusory terrain redirected armored columns into kill valleys seeded with transmutation traps that turned ground into liquid mud beneath heavy vehicles. Imperial countermeasures adapted with equal intensity. Orbiting platforms began projecting wide-spectrum disruption waves before major landings. Psychological warfare units broadcast tailored surrender offers translated into local dialects and myth references. Collaborator states were granted aerial support and defensive shield domes, making alliance visibly profitable. Entire populations relocated behind imperial protection lines for food security and medical technology unknown to their world. These protectorates became proof-of-concept colonies, demonstrations that submission meant prosperity. The moral complexity fractured resistance messaging. Not every citizen wanted liberation if liberation meant endless monster attacks and scorched harvests. Meanwhile, something unexpected emerged along the gate corridor itself. Prolonged cross-reality transit began altering both technology and biology. Equipment that passed repeatedly through the aperture showed minor, but measurable deviations from manufacturing tolerances, as if probability itself had roughened. Living organisms exposed to sustained gate radiation developed unusual traits. Heightened intuition, sensory bleed-through, occasional precognitive flashes. Imperial medical divisions classified it as dimensional drift syndrome. Fantasy scholars called it awakening. Jointly, though reluctantly, they studied it. The implication was staggering. The gate was not just a door, but a mutagenic boundary that rewrote interaction rules over time. Black projects accelerated. Imperial Science Command authorized controlled fusion of artifact cores with energy weapons. The first prototype produced a beam that curved in midair toward hostile intent signatures rather than heat or motion. It worked once, spectacularly, then consumed its power team in a feedback implosion. Even failure proved the concept. Magic could be coerced into technological obedience, but it demanded a price structure the Empire did not yet understand. That did not slow development, it intensified it. On the resistance side, leaders realized they could not win through direct confrontation or static defense. Their new doctrine centered on narrative warfare, turning every imperial action into a story of violation that rallied neutral populations. Traveling illusionists replayed invasions in town squares, magnifying civilian losses and framing collaborators as oathbreakers cursed by fate. Songs spread faster than orders. Symbols replaced banners. The war became cultural as much as tactical. Desertion rates in auxiliary forces rose when troops feared spiritual consequences more than disciplinary ones. Large-scale engagements grew rarer but more decisive. When they happened, they reshaped regions. One clash between a Walker Legion and a summoned Titan ended, with both sides annihilated, and a crater lake formed from fused sand and condensed storm clouds. Another saw aerial fighters dragged from the sky by gravity inversion spells that briefly flipped directional constants. Each side learned, adjusted, escalated. Neither achieved clean dominance. The conflict matured into a grinding adaptive war, where every victory generated a new category of threat. Imperial High Command finally accepted the conclusion field officers had been reporting for months. This was not a primitive world with exotic weapons. It was a peer adversary operating under different laws. The objective shifted from rapid conquest to permanent control architecture. Gateside shipyards expanded. Fortress cities multiplied. Generational occupation planning began. That decision ensured the war would not end quickly, and ensured that what came next would be even more transformative than the invasion itself. The war crossed a threshold when both sides stopped trying to win quickly and started preparing to win permanently. That change reshaped every battlefield decision. The invasion was no longer an expeditionary campaign launched by the Galactic Empire through a dimensional corridor. It became an interreality occupation doctrine built for decades, possibly centuries. Fortresses replaced forward camps. Terraforming probes landed beside enchanted forests. Orbital foundries began manufacturing prefabricated cities designed to lock territory down with shield grids and atmospheric regulators. The fantasy world was not being raided anymore. It was being rewritten piece by piece into an imperial frontier, and the realization spread fear faster than any bombardment ever had. Imperial engineers established the first gate corridor megabase directly around the portal structure. The design fused siege logic with starport architecture. Layered shield domes overlapped like scales. Ground-to-orbit cannons stood beside dimensional stabilizers. Patrol craft flew constant loops between the gate mouth and high atmosphere, ensuring no large magical construct could approach undetected. What made the megabase different from earlier installations was its redundancy. Every system had analog fallback and magical countermeasure integration. Captured runic circles were embedded into power relays. Warded stone from conquered citadels reinforced reactor housings. The Empire had moved beyond countering magic. It was now incorporating it structurally. This hybridization produced unexpected advantages. Shield harmonics stabilized when etched with certain sigil geometries. Sensor ghosts caused by illusion magic dropped sharply when scanner housings were lined with consecrated silver. Even skeptical officers had to admit results mattered more than ideology. A quiet doctrinal amendment circulated through command channels. Usable power, regardless of origin, qualified as imperial technology once controlled. That single sentence opened the door to accelerated techno-arcane fusion programs across the occupation zone. Resistance forces answered with their own escalation. Rather than attacking fortresses directly, they targeted the Empire's new dependency chains. Hybrid systems required rare reagents, attuned crystals, and ritual calibrations performed by coerced local specialists. Resistance cells began extraction campaigns focused not on destroying bases, but stealing back knowledge keepers. Entire strike groups existed solely to rescue captured runesmiths and lay cartographers. The rescues were costly but effective. Each recovered expert slowed imperial integration timelines by months. War planners started treating scholars like strategic weapons. The battlefield itself grew stranger as combined methods matured. Imperial platoons advanced behind portable shield bubbles, traced with rotating glyph projections that disrupted curse vectors. Resistance mages answered by shaping spells that bypass shields not by force, but by intent misdirection, convincing defensive systems they were friendly signals. Stormtroopers found themselves fighting illusions that triggered their own identification protocols. Friendly fire incidents rose until Command revised targeting logic to include probabilistic anomaly flags, essentially teaching machines to suspect reality itself. Combat training expanded to include cognitive resilience drills alongside marksmanship. Creatures once considered legendary entered regular war reports. Dragon flights struck supply convoys at dusk, timing their attacks when sensor glare peaked. In response, TIE patrols flew mirrored formations with heat diffusion, plating, and sonic disorientation bursts tuned to draconic inner-ear structures. Giant forest guardians uprooted relay towers, so the Empire deployed seismic anchors and vibronet trenches that destabilized massive footfalls. Every myth met a countermeasure, and every countermeasure inspired a new, mythic adaptation. The arms race was no longer linear. It spiraled. Political warfare intensified behind the lines. Imperial governors sponsored controlled autonomy zones, where local rulers kept titles under imperial oversight. These zones received weather control satellites, crop enhancers, and medical nanotherapy in exchange for loyalty oaths and troop levies. Some populations accepted, seeing tangible improvement in daily survival. Others viewed the arrangement as spiritual contamination. Civil conflict ignited within kingdoms, turning the broader war into a layered struggle of collaboration versus preservation. Resistance leadership struggled to maintain unity when some villages openly preferred imperial order to magical uncertainty. Religious institutions became decisive actors. Prophetic circles declared the gate an existential trial, either a curse to be sealed or a forge to remake the world stronger. Competing interpretations split alliances. One sect taught that learning the invaders' methods was sacred adaptation. Another preached total rejection of off-world influence. Imperial intelligence exploited the division by quietly funding adaptive sects and leaking visions suggesting destiny favored technological ascension. Belief itself became a battle space, mapped and manipulated like terrain. Meanwhile, long-duration exposure to cross-reality conditions continued altering personnel. Veteran Imperial units stationed near the gate reported heightened reflexes and dreamlike pattern recognition during combat. Some could anticipate enemy spell timing with eerie accuracy. Medical Command classified it as neural overfitting to dimensional variants. Fantasy scholars argued the soldiers were developing proto-attunement. Whatever the cause, mixed reality veterans outperformed fresh troops by measurable margins. Command responded by rotating elite units through gate proximity tours, effectively weaponizing exposure. Large-scale engagements shifted toward objective denial rather than territorial gain. Instead of conquering cities, the Empire sometimes rendered them magically inert by installing disruption pylons that flattened ambient energy gradients. These dead zones prevented large spellworks, but also crippled local enchantment-dependent infrastructure, creating refugee crises. Resistance strategists exploited the humanitarian fallout, escorting displaced populations to free territories and framing the Empire as a reality-poisoning force. Propaganda murals depicted gray circles devouring color. The image stuck. A breakthrough or catastrophe, depending on perspective, emerged from a classified fusion experiment combining artifact cores with hypermatter reactors. The resulting engine produced a controlled distortion field where probability bent toward operator intent within a limited radius. In testing, projectiles curved around cover, and defensive spells misfired. The field worked for 6 minutes before collapsing into a localized reality shear that erased a test range from maps and memory logs alike. Surviving observers disagreed on what had existed there before. Even Imperial Science Command hesitated, but development did not stop. The promise of intense-shaped physics was too powerful to abandon. Resistance High Command concluded that waiting meant assimilation. They drafted a campaign aimed not at bases or armies, but at the gate itself. Not to close it, that seemed beyond current capability, but to make it unpredictable. Ritual networks, spanning continents, synchronized for a single purpose. Introduce chaotic harmonics into the portal's resonance. If successful, transit windows would fluctuate, supply schedules would fail, and occupation logistics would strain. It was a gamble that required near-total coordination and exposed every major magical order to detection. They chose to attempt it anyway. As preparations advanced, skirmishes intensified across the corridor. Imperial patrols reported rising anomaly spikes. Diviners on the resistance side sensed the portal's pulse changing tempo. Both sides understood something decisive approached. The war had moved beyond invasion and defense into reality engineering. Whoever controlled the rules of crossing would control the future shape of the conflict, and neither side intended to yield that power. The attempt to destabilize the gate did not begin with an explosion or a visible storm. It began with silence. Across the fantasy world, ritual circles that normally pulsed with color dimmed at the same hour. Towers that tracked star paths went dark. Oracle pools turned opaque. The synchronized withdrawal of magical noise was itself the opening move. Imperial monitors around the portal corridor detected the drop immediately. Background energy variance, once chaotic but constant, flattened into an unnatural calm. Analysts first suspected system failure, then coordinated hostile action. Alert levels surged across every fortress tied to the corridor network, and rapid response wings were launched before the Resistance even completed Phase 1 of their plan. The strategy behind the ritual network was elegant and dangerous. Instead of striking the portal directly, the Resistance altered the world around it. By damping global magical resonance in carefully timed waves, they intended to force the gate to overcompensate. The portal functioned like a pressure valve between realities. Reduce ambient energy on one side, and its stabilizers would push harder, widening tolerances and introducing fluctuation. Fluctuation meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant Imperial logistics, built on precision transit windows, would fracture. The risk was that overcorrection could also tear the aperture wider or spawn uncontrolled microgates elsewhere. Resistance leaders accepted the risk. A stable invasion was worse. Imperial command reacted with layered counter-protocols. Corridor stabilizers were pushed above safety margins. Power draw tripled. Auxiliary reactors spun up across orbiting platforms. Convoys scheduled for later transit were ordered through immediately to avoid window collapse. The sky over the megabase thickened with traffic as ships raced the mathematics of dimensional drift. Several vessels reported visual distortion inside the transit tunnel. Shapes moving against flow, echoes of destinations not on their charts, flashes of landscapes made of geometry rather than matter. Two freighters never emerged. Their telemetry ended mid-sentence, with sensor feeds showing branching corridors where only one should exist. On the ground, the magical silence created battlefield anomalies. Spells that relied on environmental energy faltered, but internally powered abilities, bloodline gifts, soul-bound enchantments, instinctive transformations, grew sharper by contrast. Combat became more personal and less theatrical. Elite resistance units trained for low magic conditions launched precision raids during the dampening window. Without grand spells lighting the sky, they moved unseen through Imperial sensor shadows created by stabilizer overload glare. Supply depots burned. Relay towers were sabotaged with non-magical methods to avoid detection thresholds. The message was clear. The Resistance could fight without spectacle. Imperial troops adapted faster than expected. Units drilled for electromagnetic blackout conditions applied similar discipline here. Optical targeting replaced auto-aim assists. Line-of-sight tactics returned. Old infantry doctrine. Overlapping fields of fire measured advances. Redundant communication chains. Proved brutally effective against resistance groups accustomed to magical amplification. Casualties rose on both sides. The dampening phase equalized certain engagements, and equalization favored whoever executed fundamentals better in the moment. Then, the gate reacted. Without warning, the portal surface shifted from mirror smooth to faceted like a crystal struck from inside. Transit alarms triggered across every connected installation. Instead of a single aperture, readings showed layered thresholds sliding against each other. The stabilizer array tried to lock onto a center point that kept moving. A scheduled destroyer-class vessel entering the corridor emerged partially, its forward third exiting normally, while the rest remained phased. Rescue teams watched the visible section drift like a cutaway model, crew frozen in mid-motion, before the structure snapped back and vanished entirely. No debris followed. No energy spike explained it. The event rewrote every safety assumption in Imperial crossing doctrine within seconds. Resistance ritual circles shifted from dampening to harmonic injection. Having forced overcompensation, they now fed pattern surges into the world's energy grid to create oscillation. The gate began to pulse. Transit windows opened and closed irregularly. Small objects were expelled without entry commands. Stones, fragments of metal, unknown organic residue, as if the portal were coughing. One pulse produced a rain of fine dust later identified as pulverized alloy from a shipyard light years away on the other side. Cause and effect no longer respected distance cleanly. Imperial Science Command authorized emergency experimentation in live conditions. Prototype intent field engines were activated near the corridor to convince local probability to favor stability. The effect worked briefly. Portal oscillation narrowed. Transit readings smoothed. Then side effects appeared. Nearby soldiers reported auditory hallucinations of commands not issued. Sensor drones returned impossible duplicate scans showing structures that did not exist physically. The engines were bending outcome likelihood, but they were also blurring verification itself. Command shut them down before operational trust collapsed completely. The resistance pushed their advantage with symbolic force. During a peak oscillation pulse, a coalition of high-tier casters opened dozens of short-lived microgates behind Imperial lines, not for troop movement, but for message projection. Illusory broadcasts appeared in garrisons, showing occupied cities restored and invaders gone, paired with a simple declaration that reality rejected permanent occupation. Though tactically harmless, the psychological effect was sharp. It suggested the gate could be contested, not merely endured. Morale metrics dipped across several units previously rated as steady. Imperial counterintelligence answered with its own psychological strike. Using captured scrying techniques merged with holoprojection, they transmitted visions into resistance strongholds depicting futures where technological magic fusion cured plagues, extended life, and ended famine, but only under Imperial governance. The images were tailored to each region's fears and hopes. Some dismissed them as lies. Others hesitated. Doubt slowed coordination more effectively than any weapon. Battlefield ecology shifted under oscillation stress. Creatures sensitive to dimensional flow migrated toward or away from the corridor in erratic patterns. Predator species appeared where they had never been recorded. Weather systems bent around pulse timings, creating spiral storms that tracked portal rhythm rather than atmospheric logic. Imperial meteorological teams and resistance sky readers reached the same conclusion independently. The gate was no longer just a doorway. It was becoming a climate driver between realities. A joint Imperial Engineering Council proposed the most extreme solution yet: build a secondary artificial gate anchor on their side and force synchronization from two endpoints. The construction would require enormous resources and continuous exposure to oscillation risk, but if completed, it could pin the corridor's behavior within tighter tolerances. Critics warned it might also lock the connection permanently, eliminating any chance the portal would collapse. On its own, approval debates were fierce but brief. Control outweighed caution. Construction orders were issued. Resistance leadership interpreted the artificial anchor plan as existential escalation. If the corridor became fixed, the invasion would be irreversible at a structural level. They accelerated plans for a direct strike not at the portal, but at the stabilizer intelligences managing it, the predictive cores calculating transit safety. Destroy prediction, and forced synchronization would fail. Specialized teams trained to infiltrate data fortresses rather than battlefields. Their weapons would be paradox scripts, logic curses, and pattern-breaking rituals aimed at machine foresight itself. As both operations advanced, anchor construction and prediction sabotage, the war entered a new phase defined less by territory and more by control of possibility. The side that governed what could happen next would dictate everything that followed. The gate, once merely a passage, had become the central weapon, the central vulnerability, and the central prize of the entire conflict. The artificial anchor project transformed the invasion from a campaign into an engineering war measured in megatowers, orbital scaffolds, and probability equations. The command behind the effort came directly from the high doctrine of the Galactic Empire. If a doorway could not be trusted, then build the wall around the doorway and own the wall. Shipyards in orbit over the primary corridor base stopped producing warships entirely and redirected output to ring segments, gravitic pylons, and dimensional braces. What had once been a forward operating zone became a construction sphere kilometers thick, layered with shield shells and defense grids. The anchor would not merely stabilize the gate, it would cage it. The structure took shape as a segmented halo of interlocking superframes positioned around the portal's local space. Each segment housed phase lock emitters designed to project a constant mathematical identity into the corridor. Instead of reacting to fluctuation, the anchor would define acceptable fluctuation and reject everything else. The theory was brutally simple. Reality between universes would be forced to match imperial tolerances or be sheared away. Loss projections were high. Command approved them anyway. Predictability was worth sacrifice. Construction under oscillation conditions proved lethal. Pulse events bent measurement tools, causing distances to misreport and angles to drift. Assembly crews sometimes aligned components perfectly according to instruments, only to discover visible misalignment meters wide. Correction required visual confirmation teams, then triple checks by independent sensor suites running different interpretive models. Even then, error crept in. Several half-completed segments destabilized and folded inward like crushed latticework, vanishing with their crews in silent implosions that left no debris field, only a brief absence in starshine. Resistance intelligence watched the build with growing alarm. Their seers could not view the anchor directly. Technology produced blind zones and divination, but they could see its absence in probability maps, like a mountain casting a future shadow. Consensus formed that once the ring closed, spontaneous collapse of the gate would become nearly impossible. They accelerated the prediction core sabotage plan. The target was not hardware, but foresight, the analytic engines that told Imperial Command when transit was safe, when pulses would occur, and how oscillations would propagate. These predictive cores were not single machines, but distributed cognition arrays spread across hardened data citadels. Each node calculated fragments of the future and cross-validated with the others. To blind the system, the resistance needed not destruction, but contradiction. Their strike teams carried pattern curses encoded in symbolic mathematics, self-propagating paradoxes designed to introduce mutually exclusive forecasts into the network. If enough nodes disagreed violently enough, Command would lose confidence in every projection. Without trusted prediction, anchor synchronization would be delayed or canceled. Insertion required unprecedented cooperation among rival magical orders. Illusionists masked approach vectors. Runebreakers disabled perimeter sigils adapted from captured lore. Beast Riders transported teams across terrain warped by portal weather, navigating spiral storms that rotated opposite planetary spin. The teams moved during oscillation peaks, when sensor reliability dipped and Imperial patrol timing slipped out of phase with local clocks. Even then, survival margins were narrow. Several squads vanished mid-transit between concealment wards, their last signals indicating sudden corridor echoes where open ground should have been. Imperial counterintelligence detected anomalies not through prophecy, but through logistics. Supply requests at certain data citadels began to mismatch consumption curves. Micro-delays appeared in prediction updates, fractions of seconds at first, then whole seconds, as if the system hesitated. Hesitation in a war built on timing was intolerable. Security escalated to fortress protocol. Entire facilities were sealed, staff rotated, and machine-only corridors activated. Autonomous sentry units replaced organic guards to eliminate deception vectors. That decision solved one vulnerability and opened another. Machines trusted their inputs absolutely. The first paradox script entered through maintenance code piggybacked on a calibration update. It did not crash the node. It offered it two perfectly valid futures with identical probability weights and incompatible outcomes. The node flagged ambiguity and asked its peers. Two peers, already seeded with complementary paradoxes, answered with reinforced contradiction. The network did exactly what it was designed to do. It tried to reconcile the difference by increasing simulation depth. that increased computational load and widened the contradiction space. Within minutes, 3 nodes were predicting mutually exclusive pulse schedules with absolute confidence. Command dashboards lit with red conflict markers. Transit windows that had been narrowing now multiplied into overlapping options, each labeled optimal by at least one node. Anchor construction algorithms, dependent on timing forecasts, paused automatically rather than risk misalignment. The build slowed. Resistance leadership marked it as the first strategic success against the Anchor initiative. Imperial response was swift and characteristically severe. Rather than debug in place, Command authorized prediction quarantine. Compromised nodes were isolated and replaced by fresh cores grown from sealed templates. Data from the paradox interval was discarded entirely, even at the cost of losing weeks of refined modeling. To prevent reinfection, new nodes were given adversarial filters trained specifically on magical logic structures. The machines learned to recognize spell-like recursion patterns the way intrusion software recognizes malware signatures. The resistance adapted again. If paradox scripts were now detectable, they would use truth overload instead. Instead of contradictions, they injected vast volumes of accurate but contextless future fragments. Weather shifts, troop movements, minor skirmish results, stripped of causal hierarchy. The prediction cores were flooded with correctness that could not be prioritized. Forecast accuracy remained high in isolation but collapsed in usefulness. Command received answers without relevance. Decision speed dropped. While the unseen war over foresight raged, visible war intensified across the fantasy world. Imperial doctrine shifted toward corridor depth security. Instead of spreading occupation thinly, forces concentrated along reinforced lanes stretching from the gate outward like armored rivers. Each lane combined sensor towers, shield domes, and rapid response armor columns. Territory between lanes was not abandoned, but deprioritized, turned into monitored wilderness rather than governed space. The move conceded symbolic control but protected logistics, a trade the Empire accepted easily. Local factions exploited the gaps. Mobile kingdoms relocated into the spaces between lanes, becoming moving polities that Imperial mapping struggled to pin. Trade caravans transformed into armed convoys with illusion escorts. Some neutral cities negotiated corridor access treaties, exchanging safe passage for supplies and technical learning. Others became resistance sanctuaries disguised by migratory architecture, buildings designed to be dismantled and reassembled overnight. The war became less about borders and more about motion. Cultural contamination accelerated. Imperial medtech eliminated diseases in several occupied regions, earning grudging cooperation. In exchange, magical artisans repaired environmental damage from industrial extraction using geomancy the Empire could not replicate. Hybrid workshops appeared where engineers and enchanters co-designed tools neither tradition could build alone. These places were watched carefully by both sides, seen as either seeds of a new order or nests of dangerous independence. Anchor construction reached 70% completion when the largest oscillation surge yet recorded struck the corridor. The gate's surface refracted into dozens of layered apertures, each showing a different destination slice. Oceans of glass, cities built on vertical cliffs, battlefields frozen mid-charge. Transit control froze all movement. For 13 minutes, reality offered choices instead of routes. Several small craft attempted opportunistic jumps into alternate apertures without authorization. None returned. Sensor ghosts suggested at least one survived somewhere, just not anywhere connected to known maps. The surge proved the Anchor's necessity to Imperial leadership and its danger to everyone else. Orders came to finish the ring at any cost. Labor drafts expanded. Defensive fleets doubled. Prediction cores were given direct command authority to override human hesitation. The machine foresight war and the construction war fused into one operational priority. Close the halo, lock the gate, end uncertainty. Resistance leaders, reading the same signs through different instruments, reached the same timeline estimate. They had one major strike window left before synchronization would become irreversible. Plans shifted from disruption to decisive interference. The next operation would not be subtle, not distributed, and not deniable. It would be aimed at the anchor itself, not to destroy every segment, which was impossible, but to misalign just one at the moment of closure. In a structure that enforced identity across universes, a single wrong constant could turn stability into a permanent wound between worlds. The misalignment strike was designed around a single terrifying insight. The anchor ring did not need to be destroyed to fail. It only needed to be convinced of the wrong truth at the wrong moment. Every segment of the structure enforced dimensional identity through synchronized constants derived from prediction core models. If one segment accepted a slightly different constant at the instant of closure, the ring would not explode. It would agree with itself incorrectly. The corridor would still stabilize, but its destination lock would drift, binding two realities along a skewed seam that neither side fully controlled. That seam would become a permanent fault where physics argued with itself. To achieve that outcome, resistance planners abandoned stealth doctrine and embraced inevitability doctrine. The strike would be visible, loud, and costly. Its purpose was not concealment, but timing pressure. Imperial defense would be forced to respond with overwhelming force, compressing decision cycles and increasing reliance on automated synchronization. Machines would choose speed over verification. Speed created the opening. 3 assault vectors were prepared. The first consisted of sky leviathans armored in mirrored sigils, their hides etched with reflection, wards meant to scatter targeting beams and confuse range-finding. They would approach from high altitude through the storm belts generated by portal weather, where sensor refraction already degraded accuracy. The second vector involved ground tunneling constructs, living burrowers guided by geomancers, tasked with breaching the anchor's substructure pylons and introducing harmonic vibration into their foundations. The third vector was the most dangerous, a cadre of oath-bound arcanists carrying a calibrated false constant encoded into a ritual lattice. They would not survive deployment. The lattice would. Imperial command anticipated attack, but misread its form. Fleet doctrine expected a strike at shipyards or prediction citadels, not the anchor segments themselves. Patrol patterns favored perimeter interception over vertical incursion. The mirrored leviathans pierced that assumption. They descended through ionized cloud layers like falling moons, reflecting targeting locks into empty coordinates. Several were destroyed immediately, but enough survived to force defense grids into maximum output mode. Shield harmonics shifted to counter the reflection effect, and that shift produced measurable latency across the anchor's synchronization network. On the surface, the tunneling constructs erupted beneath 2 support pylons and began singing. The sound was not audible, it was geological, a pressure wave hymn that traveled through rock and metal alike. Anchor segments compensated automatically by increasing structural rigidity fields. That compensation demanded more power and introduced micro-delays in constant reconciliation between segments. The ring did not notice the danger. It noticed only noise. The Arcanist cadre moved under the cover of both assaults, escorted by irregular fighters wielding captured technology and native spellcraft in reckless combination. Their path led through a maintenance aperture that had been sealed twice and reopened twice during construction revisions. A bureaucratic scar overlooked by security algorithms trained on current schematics. Inside, gravity orientation fluctuated along curved corridors lined with phase emitters that hummed like distant choirs. Several escorts collapsed as their inner ears failed under shifting vectors. The cadre continued, counting heartbeats instead of steps. Imperial defenders converged with brutal efficiency once intrusion was confirmed. Shock units deployed in sealed armor, advancing behind mobile shield slabs, while drone swarms filled overhead space with overlapping fields of fire. The corridors became storms of blue light and ricocheting force. Resistance escorts answered with prism barriers and gravity knots that twisted incoming bolts into spirals. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the fight accomplished its purpose. It consumed response bandwidth and forced local command to delegate synchronization authority entirely to automated systems to maintain closure schedule. At the core of Segment 12, the Arcanist unfolded the lattice. It resembled a suspended web of glass threads, each vibrating with encoded values. The false constant was not random. It was carefully adjacent to the true one, close enough to pass sanity checks, distant enough to redirect identity resolution at the final instant. The lattice required a living anchor to bind. The cadre leader stepped into its center and began the vow sequence, surrendering name, memory, and continuity in exchange for imprint. As the vow progressed, the lattice brightened, harmonizing with the segment's emitters. Sensors read it as calibration assistance. Elsewhere in the structure, command presence arrived in person. The dark shuttle cut through defensive traffic with priority clearance, docking directly at a command spindle overlooking the half-closed ring. From its ramp emerged Darth Vader, his armor reflecting the anchor's glow like a moving void. He did not need briefings. The Force translated the corridor's instability into pressure behind his eyes. Officers reported anomalies, delays, contradictions. He listened in silence, then ordered manual oversight restored to the synchronization chain. The machines had been trusted long enough. Manual oversight came too late to prevent the next cascade. The tunneling constructs reached resonance, and the pylons sang back, a feedback loop that blurred timestamps across the segment network. Segment 12, already influenced by the lattice, accepted its local constant as authoritative for a fraction of a second longer than protocol allowed. That fraction was enough. The segment announced readiness with a false value embedded. Vader felt the wrongness immediately, not as a number, but as a flavor in the Force, a taste of misaligned destiny. He moved through the command deck like a drawn blade, issuing counterorders that snapped staff into motion. Override codes were transmitted. Some segments complied. Segment 12 did not. Its calibration had become self-justifying, reinforced by the vow-bound imprint now fused to its emitters. The anchor approached closure threshold. Segments began final alignment, projecting identity beams toward a shared geometric center. If 12 remained wrong at the instant of lock, the corridor would bind skewed. Vader chose decisive intervention. He ordered a localized power drop to Segment 12. A risky maneuver that could destabilize neighboring segments, but might break the lattice's hold. Engineers warned of cascade failure probabilities. He advanced anyway. Power relays tripped. Lights dimmed. The lattice flickered but did not die. Vow energy sustained it. Vader descended personally toward the segment core, cutting through sealed doors with precise arcs of crimson light. Resistance survivors attempted a last stand and were swept aside by invisible force or blade. At the chamber threshold he paused, sensing the human presence dissolving inside the web, identity unraveling into constant. He recognized sacrifice as a weapon and despised its efficiency. He reached into the lattice with the Force, not to destroy, but to interrogate. The false constant resonated like a nearly correct chord. He could feel the difference, the way it pulled the corridor's destination a degree off true. Rather than severing the lattice directly, he introduced counter-pressure, bending the value toward truth by sheer will, compressing probability around the correct constant. The chamber groaned. Emitters cracked. The vow-bound imprint screamed without sound as it was forced to choose between coherence and purpose. Across the ring, segments reported divergence, then convergence. Closure timers froze, restarted, froze again. Command decks shouted conflicting status updates. Prediction cores, newly sanitized, produced 3 different outcomes simultaneously and flagged all as urgent. The halo glowed with braided light, each segment arguing geometry with its neighbors. The final moment came not as an explosion, but as a decision. Segment 12 accepted Vader's imposed correction. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. The anchor ring closed. Identity beams met and locked. The corridor stabilized with a violent sigh that rippled across space like a stone dropped in gravity itself. Shock waves traveled through fleets and storms alike. Several ships lost power. One anchor segment warped permanently. its outer rim twisted like softened metal. The gate held. Victory was declared within minutes, but the data told a more complicated story. Stabilization succeeded, yet the destination lock exhibited microdrift, tiny, persistent offsets that no recalibration fully erased. Transit remained possible, predictable, and controllable, but never perfectly centered. The seam between worlds had been forced into alignment under duress. It obeyed, reluctantly. On the ground, Resistance observers felt the change as pressure lifting and settling simultaneously. The window for catastrophic misalignment had closed. Their decisive strike had failed in its primary objective, yet it had achieved something unintended. The anchor was now dependent on continuous correction. The Empire had built its cage, but the bars required constant hands to hold them straight. Imperial Command reorganized corridor doctrine overnight. The anchor became the most guarded structure in two realities. Manual oversight was embedded permanently alongside machine prediction. Segment 12 was encased in redundant field shells and monitored for deviation at quantum intervals. The gate was no longer a wild wound. It was a managed scar. The war did not end with closure. It changed shape. With stability came scale. Reinforcements could flow without fear of corridor collapse. So could consequences. Stability transformed the invasion from an expedition into a migration of force. With the anchor ring locked and the corridor caged into predictable behavior, the war machine of the Empire no longer moved in cautious pulses, but in sustained rivers of metal and fire. Reinforcement waves crossed daily. Armored divisions, atmospheric assault carriers, prefabricated fortress modules, and industrial harvest rigs, each arrival precisely timed to the anchor's corrected drift tables. The gate's mouth in the fantasy world expanded into a permanent war port, surrounded by layered shield domes and kilometer-wide landing grids carved from once sacred plains. The sky never darkened fully there anymore. Engine glow replaced sunset. Occupation doctrine evolved accordingly. Rather than probing outward in narrow lanes, Imperial planners initiated the grid advance, a geometric expansion pattern that overlaid the region with interlocking control hexes. Each hex contained a sensor tower, a rapid response garrison, and a denial battery capable of sealing airspace in seconds. The method did not require total troop saturation. It required overlapping threat projection. Resistance forces found that whenever they struck one hex, three neighbors answered. The battlefield became mathematical. The fantasy world answered with asymmetry raised to art. Kingdom banners disappeared from open fields and reappeared as coded thread patterns in civilian clothing. Armies dissolved into guild networks. Castles were abandoned as command centers and reborn as decoys rigged with illusion layers and collapsing corridors. True leadership traveled disguised within merchant caravans protected by probability charms that bent coincidence in their favor. Bridges collapsing after they crossed. Patrols turning down wrong roads for trivial reasons that felt like fate. Magic adapted fastest where it embraced limitation instead of fighting it. Large spells drew sensors. Subtle spells passed beneath notice. Whisper casting schools rose. Practitioners who shaped outcomes with minimal energy signatures. Loosening a bolt here, delaying a message there, nudging a decision at the moment of doubt. Imperial officers began to distrust luck itself. When three separate commanders tripped at critical moments during unrelated engagements, an internal advisory was circulated on microcausality sabotage. Helmets gained balance gyros. Railings gained redundant grips. Even chance became an enemy category. The stabilized corridor also enabled something planners had only theorized: cross-world logistics loops. Raw materials extracted in the fantasy realm, rare crystals, mana-reactive metals, bioactive resins, were shipped through the gate, refined with Imperial industry, then returned as enhanced components for hybrid weapons and shields. The feedback cycle accelerated technological mutation. Blaster arrays, tuned with mana crystals, achieved higher coherence and lower heat loss. Shield generators, etched with runic geometry, held longer under sustained fire. Neither side recognized the weapons fully anymore. They were becoming something new. Not all consequences favored the Empire. Prolonged proximity between corridor physics and native magic began producing ecological anomalies. In regions under heavy grid control, wildlife developed unpredictable traits, animals stepping briefly out of phase with terrain, plants growing in spiral symmetries that interfered with sensor returns. Imperial science teams classified it as cross-field resonance. The anchor's enforced constants leaked into local reality, and local reality answered back. Suppression fields were deployed, but they worked like lids on boiling pots, effective, never comfortable. Political fractures widened among the defenders. Some city-states accepted imperial protectorate status in exchange for autonomy guarantees and medical technology. Others condemned them as collaborators. A third faction argued for conditional alliance, proposing a treaty that would limit extraction and forbid forced cultural restructuring. Negotiations opened, stalled, reopened, and stalled again, each round shaped by events on the battlefield hours before the talks. Trust became a currency inflated beyond use. Into this tension stepped a new imperial initiative, the Concord missions. Rather than soldiers, these delegations brought engineers, doctors, and legal architects. They rebuilt water systems, eliminated plagues, and codified property rights under occupation law. The strategy aimed to prove that order under imperial rule was materially superior to resistance under uncertainty. It worked in some regions. In others, it deepened hatred, especially where sacred lands were surveyed into resource blocks and ancestral forests mapped as fuel reserves. Resistance leadership debated a dangerous counter: open alliance with darker magical traditions long held in taboo. These arts specialized in entropy, curse binding, and identity erosion, weapons capable of targeting not armies but systems. The moral cost was high. Practitioners paid with lifespan, memory, or lineage continuity. After weeks of argument, limited authorization was granted under oath constraints. The first deployments targeted grid hex coordination, seeding slow-acting decay into scheduling algorithms by enchanting captured terminals and letting them be retaken. Weeks later, misalignments appeared, not failures, but inefficiencies that compounded. Imperial command answered with centralization. Grid hexes were grouped into macro sectors, overseen by mobile command fortresses that processed orders internally rather than relying on distributed updates. One such fortress became infamous among defenders, a walking citadel whose shield canopy turned aside both artillery and storm magic, whose legs crushed terrain flat into landing pads. It moved like policy made metal, indifferent and inevitable. Destroying it became a symbolic objective for multiple resistance cells, though none yet possessed the means. Far above, in the anchor's command spindle, ultimate authority reviewed the campaign with cold patience. Palpatine required no reports to understand the deeper truth. Prolonged contact between realities was not merely conquest, it was transformation. The Empire was changing by exposure. Tools grew more adaptive. Officers grew more flexible. Even doctrine showed hints of improvisation once considered weakness. He approved the trend. Adaptation was power when directed. A bold resistance operation attempted to sever that direction. Instead of striking military targets, they attacked meaning. Using broadcast hours captured in a lightning raid, they transmitted a layered illusion visible across multiple grid hexes simultaneously. A vision of imperial defeat, so detailed it included false casualty lists, fabricated command withdrawals, and simulated anchor instability readings. For 6 minutes, every unsecured display and visor feed showed the same narrative. Units hesitated. Some withdrew. Others advanced into traps, believing reinforcements were en route. When the illusion collapsed, confusion remained like smoke. The psychological strike forced new helmet protocols and hardened signal verification. It also proved that perception warfare could pierce even disciplined ranks if delivered with enough sensory authority. Both sides escalated their narrative weapons afterward. The Empire with truth-saturated briefings and constant data transparency to its troops. The Resistance with symbol-rich propaganda that turned small victories into legends overnight. Meanwhile, explorers, independent, unaffiliated, and often reckless, began using the stabilized gate's predictable drift to chart micro-branches off the main corridor. They discovered minor adjacent realms connected like side streets to the primary path, pocket worlds of strange gravity, time-dilated ruins, and energy seas. Neither Empire nor Resistance controlled these spaces yet. Smugglers and scholars rushed in. Some returned with artifacts that bent probability. Others did not return at all. A frontier beyond the invasion opened inside the invasion itself. Contact between ordinary soldiers and ordinary villagers grew more common as front lines hardened into borders. Barter markets emerged at controlled checkpoints. Language pigeons formed, blending technical jargon and spell terminology. Children learned to identify aircraft silhouettes and spell circles with equal fluency. Cultural lines blurred at ground level even as leadership rhetoric sharpened at the top. War and familiarity advanced together, an uncomfortable twin march. Through all of it, the anchor ring held, but never effortlessly. Segment 12 required constant correction. Its readings always a hair off true. Crews rotated through its chambers like watchkeepers at a restless shrine. They logged micro-deviations, applied counterpressure, and monitored harmonic echoes for signs of renewed misalignment attempts. The memory of how close the corridor had come to permanent skew became institutional caution. By the end of the campaign's second expansion phase, both sides understood the shape of the conflict. This was no longer a raid, nor even a conventional conquest. It was a contest of systems, prediction versus possibility, order versus emergence, fought across two physics and one shared seam. And every reinforcement that crossed the gate now carried not just weapons, but assumptions that the other world was determined to break. The campaign reached its breaking point not with a battle line, but with a realization. Control of territory had not produced control of outcomes. The grid held, the anchor held, the fortress sectors held. Yet the war did not converge toward victory. Instead, it diversified into complications. Every solved problem generated two unfamiliar ones. Imperial forecasts, once crisp and forward-pointing, now resembled branching trees with no dominant trunk. The fantasy world was not merely resisting. It was metabolizing the invasion and evolving around it. Imperial High Command authorized a decisive operation designed to end systemic resistance rather than continue endless suppression. The target was not a capital city, not a mage order, not a hidden army. The target was the convergence node, a planetary-scale nexus, where ley currents braided beneath the crust and re-emerged through mountain roots, ocean trenches, and storm corridors. Intelligence drawn from captured archmages and cross-field scans suggested that this nexus amplified probability shaping across the entire world. It was a hidden multiplier behind the defenders' uncanny timing, their near misses, their perfectly late arrivals that still turned battles. The plan was ruthless and elegant. Insert a macro-stabilizer array into the nexus chamber. Force the ley braid into harmonic lock with anchor physics. In one stroke, the world's magic would become predictable, measurable, governable. Not destroyed, domesticated. Resistance would lose its greatest strategic edge, emergent surprise. The nexus lay beneath a mountain range that looked like broken teeth clawing at the sky. Storms circled its peaks in permanent orbit. No large vehicles could approach without sensor blackout and shield overload. The assault force went in layered. Orbital mapping, high-altitude drops. Then low-tech ground advance, once electronics degraded. Walkers marched beside shielded infantry. Artillery used line-of-sight targeting like ancient siege engines. The deeper they moved into the mountains, the more the war resembled something medieval wearing a modern skeleton. Defenders had prepared for this approach for months. The outer passes were abandoned on purpose. Supply caches were left intact, but subtly altered. Food that drained stamina, maps that looped routes by a few degrees, shelter spells that amplified sound at night, so no one slept deeply. Fatigue became a weapon. Imperial discipline compensated, but at cost. Reaction times slowed by measurable percentages. Commanders rotated squads more aggressively, burning through reserves earlier than planned. The first true resistance line appeared not at a fortress, but at a bridge of living stone grown across a canyon. It moved slowly, like breathing rock, reconfiguring its own arches as units advanced. Demolition fire shattered sections, which regrew into new shapes that forced tighter choke points. Progress required synchronized strikes, timed to the stone's regrowth cycle. Engineers solved it, but every solution revealed the deeper pattern. This world's defenses adapted faster than doctrine could. Air superiority, normally decisive, failed outright near the nexus. Flying craft experienced direction drift. Instruments showed level flight, while pilots visually tilted 30 degrees. Horizons slid. Clouds formed geometric patterns that confused depth perception. After 3 losses, Command grounded atmospheric wings and relied on tethered drones and ground spotters. The sky itself had become partisan. Halfway up the final ascent, the mobile command fortress that had dominated earlier phases joined the push, climbing with ponderous inevitability. Its shield canopy parted storm layers like curtains. Its guns carved terraces into cliffs for follow-on units. It broadcast constant positional truth signals so disoriented squads could recalibrate their sense of direction. For a time, momentum returned to the attackers. Then the defenders unveiled their counterstroke, not against the army, but against the fortress. A circle of 12 mass casters appeared simultaneously on surrounding peaks, each anchoring a resonance pillar into the bedrock. They did not target shields or weapons. They targeted mass. The spell increased the effective inertia of the fortress by fractional increments each minute. At first it was unnoticed. Then its stride slowed. Servos overcompensated. Energy draw spiked. Within an hour, the walking citadel moved like a ship through tar. Imperial science officers identified the effect quickly, but not the solution. The spell did not apply force. It altered the relationship between force and response. Counterfields reduced, but did not cancel it. Command faced a choice: withdraw the fortress and lose the stabilizing broadcast, or keep it advancing at degrading efficiency. They chose to keep it moving. Symbol mattered. The army marched behind a slowing giant rather than retreat behind a healthy one. Resistance units exploited the reduced pace with harassment waves timed to shield cycling. Not to break through, to keep attention fragmented. No decisive clash, just constant demand. Officers reported the same frustration across channels. Nothing finished, everything interfered. At last, assault teams reached the Nexus Cavern, a chamber vast as a buried sky, its ceiling lost in luminous mist. Rivers of light flowed through stone channels and crossed in midair like woven ribbons. Sound behaved strangely there. Footsteps echoed before they landed. Instruments read power levels that defied scale. This was not a structure. It was a function made visible. Insertion of the macro-stabilizer array began immediately. Tower segments unfolded, locking together into a ringed lattice around the central braid. Each segment projected calibration beams that tried to square the flowing magic into angles and intervals. The first minutes showed promise. Reading smooth. Fluctuations narrowed. Command above ground received the cleanest predictive curves since the war began. The defenders did not rush the chamber. They walked in small numbers, unhurried, as if entering a temple already burning. Their leader, an elder whose hair shimmered with static light, spoke plainly to the Imperial commander on site. The Nexus, he said, did not belong to their side or the other. It belonged to possibility. To cage it was to collapse futures into fewer branches. War would become easier, and existence poorer. The commander answered with equal clarity. Predictability saved lives. Order prevented endless cycles of ambush and reprisal. Stability was mercy at scale. Both believed themselves. The elder offered a bargain: partial harmonization. Limit the stabilizer's range. Make battlefields predictable but leave the wider world wild. The proposal transmitted upward through command channels and return denied. Partial control invited partial chaos. The directive remained total lock. The defenders' final measure was not attack, but surrender of restraint. They released stored probability shaping into the Nexus at once. Centuries of banked anomalies discharged like floodwater. The chamber filled with branching afterimages of events that almost happened. Arrows that nearly struck, treaties that nearly held, betrayals that nearly succeeded. The macro-stabilizer lattice struggled to quantize the surge. Some segments held. Others overloaded and went dark. Reality stuttered locally. Soldiers saw themselves take different steps and corrected mid-motion. Shots landed before triggers finished pulling. A squad reported finishing a maneuver they had only just begun. Time did not reverse. It multiplied and then remerged. Training held discipline together, but barely. Engineers made the call to push the lattice beyond safe limits and force full lock in one burst rather than gradual convergence. It would either succeed instantly or fail catastrophically. Authorization came within seconds. Power routed. Cooling bled away. The lattice glowed white-blue and tightened its geometric grip around the braid. For a breath that felt like a year, everything aligned. Flow became pattern. Variance collapsed. The Nexus sang in a single tone. Then the tone cracked. Not into explosion, into divergence. The braid split into two synchronized streams, occupying the same space at different possibility phases. The lattice locked one and missed the other. Half the world's magic became predictable. Half became more volatile than ever. Instruments displayed perfect order and absolute chaos simultaneously, depending on which stream they sampled. Both sides stopped fighting long enough to understand what had happened. Control had not been achieved. Duality had. Imperial Command rapidly reframed the outcome as acceptable advantage. 50% predictability was enough to dominate major engagements. Resistance leaders reframed it as salvation. 50% wildness was enough to keep freedom alive. The war did not end. It transformed again, now fought across two overlapping rule sets, with every strategy needing a twin version. The commander at the Nexus ordered consolidation rather than pursuit. No one wanted to test what further forcing might do. The Elder and his remaining circle withdrew without interference. Neither side declared victory. Neither could claim defeat. Above, the anchor ring recorded the event as a corridor echo, a reminder that when two realities interlock, neither remains unchanged. The campaign's core threat had been confronted, but not resolved. The future had narrowed and widened at once. The war entered its final phase not with louder battles, but with clearer choices. After the Nexus split, every commander on both sides understood that total domination was no longer mathematically achievable without risking collapse of the very world being fought over. Half the planetary magic now obeyed stabilizer harmonics and could be modeled, predicted, countered. The other half surged in irregular waves, generating miracles and disasters with equal indifference. Campaign projections showed an ugly truth. Continued escalation would not produce victory. Only environmental failure, dimensional fracture, and eventual loss of the gate corridor itself. The invasion doctrine of the Galactic Empire had always assumed that resistance broke before infrastructure did. This world inverted that logic. Infrastructure, meaning the underlying magical substrate, would break first. If it did, the gate would destabilize, the anchor would fail, and the corridor would shear. Every deployed unit would be stranded or erased between physics models. Withdrawal was no longer a sign of weakness. It was now a survival variable. High Command assembled its most comprehensive cross-domain war council since the gate opened. Fleet strategists, ground marshals, science directors, psychological operations analysts, and dimensional engineers projected layered outcomes across hololithic space. The consensus formed slowly and bitterly. The world could be conquered locally, region by region, but not systemically without unacceptable loss. The gate had not opened into a primitive territory awaiting order. It had opened into a co-equal rule set that resisted total absorption. Yet retreat without leverage would invite pursuit. The defenders, emboldened by survival, would push toward the gate, attempt sabotage. perhaps even learn to project through it. That risk could not be ignored. A final operation was approved, not conquest, not extermination, but imposition of boundary. Established terms written into physics rather than treaties. The plan centered on the anchor ring and the split nexus resonance, now mapped across the planet. Engineers proposed a corridor treaty encoded as a field condition. The gate would remain open only under balanced energy exchange. Any large-scale offensive force attempting to cross in either direction would trigger automatic phase turbulence, making mass invasion physically impossible. Small teams, diplomats, traders, observers, they could pass. Armies could not. It was the closest technology could come to a law of war. To implement, it required cooperation from the Nexus-aligned mages. Not surrender, consent. Without their harmonic signatures, the field equation would not hold on the magical side. Imperial doctrine disliked dependence on external will, but numbers left no alternative. An envoy mission was authorized under shield of ceasefire. The meeting took place on a plateau overlooking the storm-ringed mountains. No weapons deployed beyond sidearms. Sensor drones hovered at respectful distance. The elder who had stood at the Nexus returned, accompanied by representatives of 3 rival magical orders who rarely shared ground. That alone signaled seriousness. The proposal was delivered with technical precision and political restraint. Not peace, structure. Not alliance, boundary. Debate lasted hours. Wind carried the smell of rain and ozone. At one point, the ground itself rippled as wild phase magic surged underfoot, reminding everyone how thin control had become. The mages argued among themselves openly. Some demanded total gate closure. Others wanted selective exchange to learn off-world science. A few argued that conflict had accelerated their own evolution and should continue. The elder listened, then reframed the choice with brutal clarity. Without boundary, both worlds risked mutual ruin. With boundary, rivalry could cool into competition. Consent was granted conditionally. The field would be co-authored. Magical signatures embedded alongside imperial harmonics. Neither side could alter it unilaterally without collapse. Mutual vulnerability as enforcement. Implementation began immediately. Anchor ring emitters recalibrated. Nexus-aligned casters wove probability threads through the equation, so the boundary would resist loopholes. The corridor between worlds brightened, then narrowed, then stabilized as a translucent column rather than an open wound. Test crossings with single shuttles succeeded. Attempted mass transit with armored columns failed exactly as designed. Phase turbulence forced automatic abort. Frontline units received the order many never expected to hear. Transition from invasion posture to perimeter sovereignty. Fortresses converted into embassies and research bastions. Occupied cities shifted to treaty ports. Patrols changed from domination sweeps to boundary enforcement. Some officers felt relief. Others felt robbed. Soldiers, who had prepared for endless advance, now learned the discipline of stopping. Not every faction accepted the outcome. Rogue warlords on the fantasy world attempted to exploit the new balance by launching localized offensives against treaty zones, believing imperial restraint meant weakness. They learned quickly that limited war still allowed overwhelming response. Precision orbital strikes, carefully tuned to avoid environmental cascade, erased 3 such armies in a single week. Boundary did not mean vulnerability. It meant rules. Within imperial ranks, debate continued. Some argued the campaign had failed its original objective. Others argued it had achieved something rarer than conquest, controlled coexistence across incompatible realities. The anchor corridor became the most studied structure in 2 galaxies worth of science archives. Cadets would study it for generations as the campaign where certainty met its equal. Cultural exchange followed tension. Magical healers studied Bacta and sterile surgery. Imperial engineers learned Livingstone growth techniques that reshaped fortification theory. Language academies formed on both sides of the gate. Trade began with cautious goods, metals for reagents, star maps for late charts. Suspicion remained. But so did curiosity. The greatest change was philosophical. Imperial doctrine quietly updated a principle for the first time in centuries. Not all unknown territories are unfinished versions of order. Some are parallel orders that must be negotiated with, not overwritten. It was not announced publicly. It did not need to be. It appeared in training simulations, then in officer exams, then in campaign planning templates. Doctrine evolves where reality insists. At the plateau where the treaty field had been sealed, a marker was raised, not a flag, but a ring of alloy and crystal fused together, each material impossible without the other. No inscription declared victory. Only coordinates and the date of stabilization. Meaning would be assigned by those who came later. The gate remained, no longer an invasion wound, but a regulated artery between worlds. Small craft passed. Scholars passed. Observers passed. Armies did not. The war that began with certainty ended with constraint, and with a new kind of power defined not by expansion, but by choosing where to stop. The final shape of the conflict was not written in firepower totals or casualty charts, but in the quiet realization that two complete systems of reality had tested each other and survived. The armies withdrew from forward assault lines, but the consequences of their clash continued to unfold across both civilizations, like aftershocks from a planetary quake. What began as a campaign of inevitable domination transformed into the first recorded case, where expansion met an equal framework and stopped by design rather than defeat. The lesson was not celebrated loudly, yet it spread with stubborn persistence through academies, temples, war colleges, and research halls alike. For the officer corps of the Galactic Empire, the campaign became a study in constraint under supremacy. Tactical superiority had not vanished. Star destroyers still ruled the sky above any battlefield they entered. Ground armor still outmatched pre-industrial defenses. But superiority proved conditional when the operating environment rewrote the assumptions beneath every weapon. Magic did not beat technology. It invalidated prediction. That distinction reshaped strategic education. Future commanders were trained not only to overpower resistance, but to detect when the rules themselves were shifting under their feet. Adaptation replaced arrogance as the higher virtue. On the fantasy world, the invasion ended centuries of isolated development in a single generation. Kingdom rivalries that once defined politics seemed smaller after contact with interstellar empire. Magical orders that had guarded secrets for millennia began publishing controlled knowledge to prevent external exploitation. Unified councils formed where feuding circles once competed. The shared memory of orbital fire and mechanized legions forced cooperation faster than any prophecy or philosophy ever had. Fear had done what diplomacy could not, but wisdom determined what came after fear faded. The gate itself changed meaning over time. At first it was watched like a loaded weapon, surrounded by layered defenses, ritual wards, and sensor grids. Every crossing was audited, every traveler examined. But familiarity, managed carefully, softened dread into protocol. Procedures replaced panic. Joint oversight teams emerged, composed of Imperial scientists and Nexus-trained casters, each verifying the other's measurements. Trust did not appear as a feeling. It appeared as repeatable verification. Reliability became the bridge where emotion could not. Trade altered daily life in subtle ways before dramatic ones. Alloys forged with microgravity purity strengthened enchanted blades beyond prior limits. Healing drafts derived from magical regeneration influenced new medical compounds. Survey satellites mapped lake currents from orbit, giving mages planetary awareness for the first time. Farmers learned weather modeling that reduced famine risk. Engineers learned geomantic load distribution that allowed structures to flex rather than crack. Neither side abandoned its foundations. Each side upgraded them. Veterans carried the deepest transformations. Soldiers who had marched expecting endless victory returned with more complicated stories. They spoke of spells that bent trajectories, storms that listened, creatures that did not fit classification tables, and enemies who fought not with blind desperation, but with coherent, disciplined purpose. Many found their worldview permanently expanded. Some struggled with it. A few built new careers as instructors precisely because they could explain what it felt like when certainty failed and professionalism had to take its place. Culturally, myths formed almost immediately. Ballads on one world described sky-iron fleets that darkened the sun. Imperial frontier folklore spoke of storm singers who could ground walkers with a gesture. Most stories exaggerated. A few understated. All of them preserved the central truth that the encounter had been real, mutual, and consequential. Over time, artists and historians corrected the extremes, but the emotional core remained. Two powers met, neither vanished. Strategically, the boundary field became the most important artifact of the age. Not because it was strong, but because it was shared. It represented the first engineered limit that both sides depended on equally. Attempts by fringe groups to bypass it always failed for the same reason. The equation required dual signatures. Sabotage hurt the saboteur first. That symmetry discouraged extremism more effectively than punishment ever could. Stability built from mutual exposure proved more durable than stability enforced by threat. In academic circles, a new discipline emerged devoted entirely to cross-rule interaction. The science of incompatible systems operating in negotiated overlap. Scholars modeled it for economics, ecology, diplomacy, and warfare. The Gate Campaign became the founding case study. Students debated alternative outcomes endlessly. What if escalation had continued? What if the nexus had collapsed? What if early diplomacy had been attempted? Those debates mattered less than the operational record itself, which showed that limits could be discovered through conflict and then enforced through design. Generations later, the first meeting between the Star Empire and the spellbound world would not be remembered as a failed conquest or a defended homeland, but as the moment expansion encountered equivalence. Not equality of weapons, but equality of consequence. Each side learned it could wound the other, and that wounding the other could also destroy itself. That realization is rare in history, and when it appears, it redraws the future. The corridor still glows between the worlds, steady and narrow, admitting voices, but never armies. Observers still pass through it, recording, learning, comparing. Children on both sides grow up knowing that another reality exists, and that it is neither myth nor prey. Commanders still study the campaign not for how it began, but for where it stopped. Scholars still refine the mathematics that keep the boundary intact. And storytellers still return to the same enduring question: what truly defines power? The ability to take everything, or the wisdom to know what must not be taken? The conclusion is not that one side won. The conclusion is that both sides endured, changed, and chose structure over annihilation. In the long arc of civilizations, that outcome outlasts victory. The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if